Tahrir alaikum jami'an. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the American University in Cairo and another of the Tahrir dialogues, which started back in 2011. As is usual, we hold these events on topics that we feel are important, topical, interesting to the audience. And we only do them, frankly, when we have speakers that we feel can address the issues, both in a sense that's relevant to the audience of non-academics, but also with the rigor of an academic foundation. Today we've chosen the topic, or the subject, of the future of Europe, a topic that's extremely interesting for me personally, and I think for all of you. Even though the Arab League was actually the first regional organization in the world to be established, we nevertheless, as Arabs living in this region, have frequently pointed towards Europe and the cooperation that developed in Europe and the institutions that developed in Europe as examples of successful engagement, dealing with issues constructively and dealing with problems constructively, and as a module to emulate as we move forward. It seems like everything in the world today, either as a function of globalization or as a function of the synergies that relate to technology, these concepts that we thought of in the past seem to be challenged. At the same time, many of the concepts prove themselves to actually be more valid and more able to deal with the challenges of the time. As in the Middle East, we talk now about identity politics, about whether we're going to have a new Middle East, a revisionist Middle East, a disintegrated Middle East, or frankly, although that's far-fetched now, a more coherent Middle East. Questions are coming up in Europe. It's no longer Western and Eastern Europe. It's an expanded Europe from the Western perspective. And there are issues as you move forward. How do you deal with issues of being closer together? How do you the issues of sovereignty? How do you deal with issues of the financial issues? But how do you, frankly, deal with the issues of different constituencies in Europe, now that it's not only the more homogeneous Western aspect of Europe? And how do you deal with Europe dealing with the issues of globalization and everything that comes with it, which basically means being closer to different parts of the world and being engaged with them? To address those issues, we wanted to go to the core, frankly. So we chose two very prominent ambassadors here in Egypt, whom we felt could address the issues concretely, whether they are Brexit or the election of new politicians who are not anti-establishment by any account, but definitely that sort of were elected in a rather novel fashion, and whom, and I say this respectfully, when they first emerged, people were wondering, well, where would they take their country? And I say I am not naming them because they come on both sides of this debate. And frankly, what I've seen over the last couple of months, a wise, active leadership that I think will help keep Europe together in spite of the challenges. To do this for us, we have Ambassador John Kaysen from the UK. He's been here now with us for a number of years, is very prominent on the Egyptian social network circuit, and is an avid fan of Mohamed Salah and the Egyptian football team. And as far as I understand, also likes Egyptian cuisine, especially during Ramadan, according to my Facebook page. And Stéphane Romaté, the ambassador of France here, who has come a bit more frequently, but has been immediately very evident in the diplomatic community. He's arranged for visits of very high-profile dignitaries, both here and also back in France for Egyptians being there. I'm very happy to welcome them both here this evening. to engage them, Dr. Ibrahim Awad, who is a professor of public policy, a long-standing friend of mine and a former ILO official, and presently the director of the Refugee and Forced Migration Center at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Ibrahim, I'll hand the floor over to you, and ambassadors, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dean Fahmy, for the introduction. And Dean Fahmy has already welcomed you, but it is my turn also to welcome you, Ambassador Kaysen and Ambassador Romate. And just allow me to introduce you very briefly. We have the ambassadors of two of the permanent members of Security Council. And they have very long CVs, but they have many common things, many common experiences. First of all, they both have graduated from very prestigious higher education institutions, Institut Politique at Paris and Cambridge University. They both worked in the region, and they both worked in Amman. They both were advisors, political advisors to their respective prime ministers. They both are long-time diplomats, but who have also served in other departments and ministries of their governments, which shows the diversity of their experiences. Ambassador Romate served also as ambassador of France in Canberra, Australia. You served in Washington, DC. So it's really a very rich experience that they bring to their service in Egypt. And we welcome you, and we're privileged to have you with us tonight. The subject of this Tahrir dialogue is the future of Europe. Of course, when you think of future of Europe, and this will probably be one of my questions to you, what do you think Europe is? When we say Europe, it's not. It sounds as obvious, but it is not certainly that obvious. Is Europe, European Union? You are about to leave the European Union, and at the same time, France is pushing for deepening integration, and this is in the tradition of France. So I think we have a very interesting subject about the internal construction of Europe, but in Egypt here and in the outside world, we think, especially in Europe, as an international actor. An international actor, and we have seen that Europe last week adopted attitudes which were different to those of its great ally, the United States, in respect of Jerusalem. So I just added these few words as introduction to just show the importance of the subject. In particular because as the European Union also at the beginning of this century came up with the concept of neighborhood, the European neighborhood. And at that time, it sounded a little bit strange. But in fact, time has shown that the European Union was correct in saying that this part of the world and Europe live in the same neighborhood. And I think that the refugee situation has brought this very clearly to the minds of everyone. So having said that, I think I will stop here in the program that I have been given. Ambassador Romate will speak first. So you have the floor, whether you would like to speak here or from the podium. So please take the podium for 12 to 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. And first, I would like to thank also Minister Nabil Fahmy for his very kind welcoming remarks, for hosting this event in such beautiful hall. It's a prestigious location. AUC is a great university, and the School for Global Affairs is a first class also center of exchange, debate, research, and you are doing, dear Minister, a great job. And thank you for you too, for your kind words, Dr. Ibrahim. This is a privilege for me to see you again. You are a great specialist of migrations, and I'm sure part of our debate will come back to this issue. But it's also a great pleasure to discuss with John. I've been here just for 4 months now, 5 months almost, and I'm following very carefully what John is doing. He's so talented, so young, so energetic. He's certainly what the British diplomatic service can produce at best. And he has a bit of advance on me, regarding social networks. I think he has several hundreds of thousands of followers. I have only several hundreds, that's all. So if you can help me tonight, just to try to fill the gap, even if the gap is immense between you and me, dear John. Having said that, thank you for giving us the chance debating on the future of Europe. Of course, it's not, natural to debate of Europe in Cairo, because this is quite far from your concerns, from your immediate concerns. At a time when the region is so divided, so fractured, debating of Europe is could be seen as a bit awkward. But my point is that certainly part of our difficulties find their origin here in the Middle East. This is why when you reflect on the future of Europe, you can't ignore what's going on in this region. I will not go in the technicalities, in the details of the European the vision of the future of Europe. I will just limit myself in a few general remarks. In fact, 3 main remarks, and then after, I'm sure, with John, will be at your disposal to continue our discussion. First, a remark on the symptoms of the crisis of Europe, and second remark on the reasons why the European project is such in the great difficulty. And my third remark will be on the necessity of refounding the European project. First remark on the symptoms of the European crisis. Evidently, obviously, Europe is going through probably the major crisis of its history. And today we can say that even, the European project is in danger, is, deeply questioned by the public opinions, by the governments. And certainly, in the long history, in the 70 last years, in the long history of the European project, thank you, this is the first time that Europe is facing a so deep crisis, which is first an internal crisis, but also a crisis created by external shocks. And if you look at the symptoms of this crisis of the European project, these symptoms are quite evident. First, this is the rejection of Europe by most of the political parties. And you see the elections in Europe, all the pro-European parties are systematically defeated. So this sounds, and this signifies something. The social democracy is in danger. I would say the conservative parties are also in a bad situation. These 2 blocks, traditional blocks of European politics, which were traditionally very pro-European, are now, marginalized in European politics and at the advantage of extremist far-right parties, which programs and which electoral success resides on the rejection of Europe. So this is a very significant sign, this rise of Euroscepticism, Europhobia even, in the European political parties. The second reason or symptom, of the crisis of the European project is that you have a dismantling process, which is now at work in Europe. And there are 2 dimensions of this dismantling process. The first one is that you see countries, even countries which were at the very origin of the project, considering or even leaving the EU. And of course, the Brexit is a major step, and I will come back to it. But you have also countries like Poland, which do not recognize themselves as, in what Europe represents today. And so you have countries which don't want to continue their, I would say, European adventure. And you have also a process of dismantling at the base, you know, with the crisis of nation state, with the crisis of federalism in Europe. And when you see, you know, regions like Catalonia, like Scotland, the crisis of federalism in Belgium, this shows that you have also a tendency of dismantling of nation-state concept in Europe. And the third symptom of this deep crisis of the European project is, you know, the expanding divide between, I would say, regional groups. The divide, quite traditional, between North and South, northern countries and southern countries in Europe. And certainly the Greek crisis has aggravated this division between the North and the South. And what is probably more concerning is also the gap which is more and more evident between East and West, between Western countries and Eastern countries which adhered to the European project just 20 or 15 years ago. And so, you know, this expansion of the divide between the groups, of course, represent a major danger for the future of Europe. And there is today a lack of spirit of solidarity between EU members, and this is of course something very concerning. My second point is that, of course, we have to address what are the causes, the reasons of such a disaffection for Europe. And the causes are quite, I would say, self-evident. I think the first one is the fact that Europe is no longer seen as a shield, you know, against all the challenges which all our countries are now facing. Europe is seen, especially by middle classes, as too open to the winds of globalization, with certainly, you know, people feeling less and less protected by Europe. Also, the fact that the youngest generation do not recognize themselves in the European project, which is, I think, the most concerning thing, when you see that most of the Europhobic populist vote comes from the young generation. This is something which, of course, is very concerning. I think the second reason why, so the first reason is that Europe is no longer seen as a bulwark of protection for European opinions. The second reason, I think, is that security, the sentiment that insecurity in Europe is now on the rise. Tensions in the East, the role of Russia, the issue of Ukraine, the obsolescence of NATO. I think there is a feeling now that Europe, you know, which was a kind of safe haven, is not protecting its population against the rise of tensions on the margins of the European continent. And I think this is also a kind of end of naivety from European countries. For decades and decades, we have just relied on the US to address our security. And as the US are withdrawing, have declared NATO as an obsolete construction, of course, we are facing, you know, responsibilities in the field of security which we are not accustomed to take into account. And I think that the third element of this, how can I say, disaffection for the European project is that the fact that there are new fears in Europe, which are very much connected to the situation in your region. The fear of migrations, of unregulated migrations, the fear of terrorism, the fear also, let me put it very simply, of the role and the place of Islam religion in our societies. And I think for many of the European opinions, Europe, in a way, is responsible for not addressing enough these kind of fears. Of course, they are very false, this is a false judgment, but this is the way the European public opinions see today Europe as not protective enough of their interest. I will just finish, and this will be my concluding remark, by saying that despite this quite of gloomy environment, of course, there is something new in Europe. There is, I think, now a feeling that a refunding of the EU project is absolutely necessary. And there is a consensus even on the fact that conditions are today met for refunding very seriously the European project. We all know what we have to do. A European defense, finishing the construction of the Eurozone, of the monetary Eurozone, protecting our borders, etc., etc. So the agenda is known. Of course, there are nuances between member states, but there is now a consensus on the fact that a refoundation of Europe is absolutely necessary. And political conditions are also, I think, more favorable. The fact that in France, we elected a president on a very pro-European mandate. And I think this is something very important. For the first time, a country quite significant in Europe has elected a leader on a pro-European agenda. And I think there will be also another favorable factor, certainly. It is the fact that, and I hope that the discussions in Germany will lead to a new coalition between the Conservative and the Social Democrats, the SPD, with also a pro-European agenda. So with a pro-European president and with a pro-European coalition in Germany, I think in the months to come, we'll see, a political background for relaunching of the European project. And I will finish with that, dear John. And I think that, in a way, Brexit is a leverage for refunding Europe. I will be very frank with you, John. I'm Anglophile. I love your country. I love your culture. I love your people, your music, everything. But I think, frankly, and I will express myself personally, that Brexit is a tragedy for Britain. It is certainly a leverage, and we can take benefit of it, as European countries, because the leaving of the EU will force us to reinvent a different Europe. But for Britain, I think this is really a tragedy. This great country will certainly lose influence. And I think if we think in terms of strategy, I see Brexit as probably as important for the British history as the loss of your empire was in the 40s and in the 50s. And I have two, concerns regarding the Brexit. The first is that Britain will lose its influence on the evolution of the EU project. So the refunding of Europe will be done without the UK, which I think would be, of course, very detrimental to your influence on the continent. And the second is that, and we see that every day, that your special relationship with the US is also diminishing because of what happens in the States with the policy of Trump, etc., etc. So you are also losing, in a way, your status of the special partner of the US. So frankly, for me, I see the Brexit as a very bad news for Europe and a very bad news for the British people. I will finish with that, just saying that, in the context of the world, with so many fractures in the Middle East, so many tensions in your region, with also this policy of the US, withdrawing from the world affairs, with the tensions arising in in Asia, around the non-proliferation issue. We need a stronger Europe. We need a new Europe. We need a Europe which has to be refounded. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaysen. I think you have already been addressed by some of the comments.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me. I address the room with a certain amount of humility, partly because I'm in the presence of so many experts on the subjects we're tackling tonight. And Stefan, thank you very much for your very thoughtful remarks. So I'm really looking forward to the question and answer session where we can hear the multiple voices in the room from this august institution. What I want to do is provoke you a little bit to try and get the conversation going. So thank you very much, Dean Fahmy. Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim, as well, for your hospitality and for this opportunity to have an exchange on these subjects. I may disappoint you a little bit, I have to say, if you've come hoping to see a classic diplomatic dust-up between the French and the British. I have to tell you, actually, I have a lot of what Stefan said resonates with me, and you'll see it has a lot of overlap with what I want to say. But to satisfy you a little bit, I will just point to a couple of areas where we perhaps differ slightly. And the first of those is actually, surprisingly, I think I'm a touch more optimistic about the future of Europe than Stefan is. And to explain that, I want you to notice, I think almost every time Stefan used the word Europe, there was a silent union often behind it. And of course, as a representative of a country that is remaining in the continent of Europe, but leaving the European Union, we're very sensitive to the difference between those two things. Europe and the European Union are two separate things. And so when Stefan said Europe now faces the major crisis of its history, clearly that means the European Union faces the major crisis of its history. Europe as a continent, as a society, as a set of political institutions, does not face the biggest crisis of its history. We've faced much worse and survived much worse than this before, and that's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic, and I don't think we should be too downcast. Because I want you to remember 1950, and Robert Schuman, great Frenchman, making his declaration, which was the origin of the institutions which became the European Union. And if you think of the context that he faced then, it explains a lot about the DNA of the European Union, which made it such a successful entity for 50 or 70 years, but also now puts it a bit at odds with the state of the world. Because Schuman was speaking as Europe stumbled out of the greatest war and greatest cataclysm in human history. It killed 53 million people, human beings killing each other at a rate never seen before or since, thank God, in history. And the nation state, that combination of the powerful modern state with nationalism into the entities of nation state, was seen as the fundamental problem of world politics. And the European Union was created to contain and constrain and protect the world from the nation state being too mighty in going to war, and in some senses, in the Cold War context, being too mighty in suffocating the economy. And in that sense, that European project was a fantastic success. Europe, the continent, Europe, the society, Europe, the economy, went on to experience the greatest period of peace and prosperity that we've ever known. So we start this moment of challenge, and maybe this moment of crisis, on quite a good foundation, because we've been blessed by those 70 years. But what's happened as we've lived through those 70 years is the global context has changed, and there's been a shift in the balance of power. And we no longer tend to see nation states as the problem, too powerful. We see the problem as being that the nation state's a bit too weak in the face of other forces, in the face of economic globalization, as Stefan mentioned, the flow of capital, the flow of jobs, the flow of people undermining the realities of the way we like to manage our economies, in the face of global threats, whether that's organized crime or extremism and terrorism or environment or even diseases, or whether that's the nature of the way power works. And those of you who've read Moses Naim will know that he has a very compelling theory that it's harder to hold on for governments now to hold on to power and use power than it ever used to be, because power exists in lots of other places. It's fragmented across society by the nature of technology, by the nature of people's expectations, by the speed with which people and ideas and events move through the world. And so as that happened, we changed the way we talked. We, the European elites, I'm speaking on behalf of Stefan and myself, on behalf of European elites, the way we talked to our populations about the European Union and what the point of it was changed. So instead of saying that this is to protect you from nation states being too powerful, we said this is to protect your nation states from globalization and to save the blessing of the nation state, if you like. And what happened in Brexit on 23rd of June 2016, when 33 million British people voted in a huge democratic exercise, and by 52% to 48%, they said we would like to leave the European Union. The British public said to us, the elite, we don't buy that. We don't believe you that this European Union you put us in is the solution in this age of globalization. In fact, we see it as contributing to the problem in this age of globalization. And there were two particular ways in which that was argued by the Brexit camp. One was about migration. In British society, there was a feeling that having received 3 million new migrants over the previous decade, the government should be managing and regulating and controlling migration. And when the government said, well, we can't do that because we're committed under the European treaties to free movement of people and we have no power to control our borders, there was a response, there was a reaction to that maybe the European Union wasn't the solution, maybe it was part of the problem. And similarly, in terms of the economy and jobs, as people felt that their traditional livelihoods were under threat from the pace of economic change, they didn't see the European model of managing the economy as the solution. And so they've given us an instruction, the British people have given us an instruction, the British government, to find a new way to manage the balance that we're all trying to achieve between keeping the roots of the nation state, keeping our societies well-rooted, our political institutions well-rooted, in terms of rooting in our identity, rooting in accountability, rooting in cohesion and control, and balancing that with being open to the world, being open to the positive side of globalization, which we have to acknowledge has achieved some of the greatest progress in human history. The thing that has brought more people, more human beings out of poverty in the last 20 years than ever before in history is not our development budgets. It's the movement of global economic change and private sector-led growth as part of globalization. And so we all face the challenge of balancing those two. So I would just like you to think of what I'm saying as a bit like Google Maps. And we're on the magnifying glass. And I've zoomed in on Brexit because I think it illuminates a problem. But this is not just a British problem. It is a problem that is shared by Europe, the continent as a whole, and the European Union, and I think by the world more generally. We all face this challenge of refounding, renewing our national models to cope with this requirement to balance openness to global change and rootedness in our societies and our institutions. And we need to beware those who, in times of stress, push on us a simplicity of response and push on us a false choice. And you see it a lot, people saying, you have to choose between globalization or looking after the nation. And that is a false choice, and we must reject it, because both sides of that choice on their own are wrong. We've learned from British politics that we can't just ignore our national roots, our identity, our accountability, but at the same time, it's very clear, and the Brexit debate is making this more and more clear, that Britain's interest remains in remaining one of the most open countries in the world. So even as we Brexit from the European Union, we are committed to being very open, and that's for obvious reasons. Our economy benefits from being extremely open. It receives more foreign investment than any other economy in Europe at record levels, and that's produced great economic success. We currently have the highest employment level in our history, 74, 75%, the lowest unemployment level since 1974. It's our openness that's given us a resilient foundation for Brexit, whether it's our car industry. We currently manufacture more cars than ever before in British history. It's our satellites, and many other things, our financial services. And of course, it's not just our economy, but it's our society. It's our openness to ideas, creativity, and exchange of ideas from all over the world that makes us the second nation after America in Nobel Prizes, that makes us have 4 of the top 10 universities in the world, that makes us a world leader in creative industries, because we're open not just to global financial flows, but we're open to ideas as well. So if we click on the Google Maps magnifying glass and just come out a bit to Europe as a whole, I would say all the things I've been describing about Britain are not unique to Britain. They are exactly the same issues that Europe faces and that the EU faces, which Stefan has very eloquently described already. So I won't go into them in detail, but I think Europe faces exactly that same tension. How do we renew our model to succeed in the age of globalization? And that means protecting our roots, protecting the accountability and the local democracy of our institutions, and at the same time being open to global change and taking advantage of it. Because if we simply put up the walls and shut the world out, we will fall behind the rest of the world very quickly. And so you can see Europe grappling with this dilemma in terms of migrant flows and in terms of refugee flows. You can see Europe grappling with this dilemma in terms of its economy, and the European model, so successful for so long, has now created a difficult legacy of debt and unemployment, particularly inside the Eurozone. It's created a gap between democratic accountability and economic management, especially for countries like Greece, which have been lashed to the monetary policy and the interest rates of Germany, and as a result have seen huge capital flows from their economy into the center of the Eurozone. And that's created a democratic crisis in the periphery. And you can see Europe grappling with this balance of global and local in terms of the democratic deficit which Stefan described, in which only 1 in 3 Europeans think that overall the EU is something that's made their countries better rather than worse off. Most Europeans think the EU is bad for their countries, not better. And we will see the same challenge going on in terms of the refounding project that Stefan describes. We can see it in the white paper that the European Commission has put out with different models. Do we have more integration of the EU, less, different types, the same? But where I'm a little bit more optimistic than Stefan is not just about Brexit, but also about Europe. I don't think this is the biggest crisis in our continent's history. I think our grandparents dealt with a lot worse. And I think the institutions that we've inherited out of that, and the depth of identity that we've inherited out of that, and the values that we've inherited out of that, are very precious assets that stand us in good stead. And I actually, the second area where I disagree with Stefan is I actually don't think Brexit, when the history books are written in 100 or 200 years' time, will occupy many pages on its own. I think it will be seen as quite a technical feature of this wider effort to refound nation states and refound democratic nation states in order to cope with globalization. And I think we will all learn together, and we will all proceed together, and we will continue to be closely integrated with European politics and European economy as we do that. And then just finally, as I finish, of course, I think it's obvious to everybody listening in this room that what I'm describing is not just a feature of Britain and Brexit. It's not just a feature of Europe, the continent, and the crisis of the European Union. It's also a feature of the rest of the world, and particularly of this region. Nation states are being challenged. They have been an engine of progress and prosperity, and so has globalization. But now the technology, the mobility that I described, and the populist rejection of the impact of that is challenging nations across the world. And in this region particularly, I think we truly can say there is a crisis of the nation state. And all the things that we diplomats spend all day grappling with, whether it's Daesh or the war in Syria, the Arab Spring, the anxieties that preoccupy the the Gulf states, I would say they are all symptoms of a fundamental underlying weakness of the states and societies of this region, which have inherited a model which needs to be updated and renewed if it's going to flourish and succeed in the 21st century. And just as I said about Britain, and just as I said about Europe, I think for this region too, it's very important to avoid the temptation of these false choices and false simplicities. So of course, on the one hand, we don't just want to undermine national institutions. We don't want chaos. We don't want to leave nations at the mercy of all the global influences and global flows, whether it's migrants, whether it's terrorists, whether it's interference from other regional powers. Too much openness, too little control of the nation is obviously a bad thing, and that's written in the story of this region in the last 5 or 6, 7 years. But also, we shouldn't allow the false alternative on the other side, where people say, if you don't want chaos, the only thing you can have is order and control, and what the British Foreign Secretary has called the cult of the strongman. Too closed is just as dangerous as too open. And I think we've seen across the region that the brittleness of Arab regimes has come from a fact that they are quite good at the business of control often, and can be quite harsh at the business of control, but they have been, over the last few decades, weak at the business of transformation, delivering services to the population, renewing the social and economic model for the 21st century. And so I think for this region, as in our continent of Europe, we need to find a third way between those false choices, between those two alternatives. And it's the third way of renewed nation states, which are developing economies which are inclusive, and which are developing political institutions which are transparent and accountable and inclusive. And of course, each country is going to figure out that balance in different ways. We're doing it in our Brexit way in Britain. France will do it in a much more EU-orientated lens because of their national DNA. Egypt will do it in its own way, and so will all the other countries of the region. But I would just end on a note of optimism, because I don't think we should lose our nerve. Every generation has to cope with change and renew its national model for change. And Britain and France and Egypt are all particularly blessed 3 countries, because we have very deeply rooted institutions. We have very deeply rooted sense of identity. And we have a very deeply rooted sense of our values and who we want to be. And I think that makes us blessed countries for this project of renewal of the nation state, because they're assets that not every country has in their hands. And if we can demonstrate the way to do it, that should be something we can offer to the rest of the world. And we in Britain turn out to often be the laboratory of the renewal of the national model in each generation. We were the first country to get into industrialization and urbanization and have to develop a modern democracy to go with it. We were the first nation, along with the French, to get into the business of what does it look like to be a post-colonial power and still be successful, confident, without an empire. And now we're going to be one of the early nations in this laboratory of managing globalization while protecting the nation state from outside the European Union. Our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers managed it, and I'm fairly confident we will too. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kaysen. Thank you very much. I think we've had 2 extremely rich interventions with many, many, many ideas. This is material for a seminar, in fact, rather than a public lectures and discussions. I will take just 5 minutes to make some comments and raise questions, and it will be up to you later after the floor is open, before to answer them. I think one term which has been coming back in both your interventions is nation state. Nation state. And there is a crisis of the nation state. You said there was a crisis of nation state, and you said there was a crisis of nation state. You said that in Europe there are secessionist movements. You said Catalonia, you said crisis of the state in Belgium. Recently in Corsica, you had a majority of nationalists and independentistes. But in reality, isn't this in the rationale of European integration? European integration, in fact, reinforced Brussels and reinforced the subnational level at the expense of the national level. So here, in fact, we're having some unexpected outcomes of European integration. I think it can be remedied. I think it can be remedied. But it goes with the growth of living organisms. They create their own crisis. And you said something extremely interesting also about European integration. The gaps between North and South, economic gaps, East and West, cultural gaps. And this creates tensions for European integration, which Britain has chosen to address on its own. Britain has thought, well, there are too many issues here. Let's address them on our own. Let's benefit from globalization. You think probably that the European Union puts a straitjacket on you. You have more. You have a larger horizon with globalization. The British public has complained from migration from Poland, from Pakistan. They have taken jobs. But you have said that employment is at its best in the UK. So in reality, migration is not to be blamed. Neither migration from Poland nor migration from the Caribbean or from Africa. So there also are misconceptions, because how can you blame migration at the same time? But of course, there are working classes which have lost. But have they lost because of migration or because of economic policies that have been implemented in by the way, not only in the EU, but even here and everywhere. So these are the roots. My next two observations are about this region and the refugees and migrants. And I tend to think that the European Union has been quite successful in dealing with refugee flows. And look at this last summer. Look at the drop of course, at the expense of some values, probably. But frankly, it has been, and the crisis has been overplayed. In fact, the crisis really is in Lebanon or in Jordan, where you have worked. And finally, to Ambassador Ouattara, President Macron, in the tradition of Robert Schuman, of Jean Monnet, of Jacques Delors, wants to push for deeper integration. And he mentioned, and you mentioned, European defense. But European defense community was beaten in France in 1954. With skepticism in Europe, even among those pro-European, what do you think? Is this, you're going to the high politics, areas of high politics that European integration and new functionaries have avoided from the very beginning in order not to raise too many concerns with the public. So these are my comments. I leave it to you whether you would like to discuss them now or later. What would you prefer? That I open the floor? What would you prefer?
John, you want to?
You go first.
Thank you. It's working, yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim, for your comments. You're right on the crisis of nation state. I said some words on that. I think there are several elements in the crisis of nation states in Europe. The first one is the crisis of welfare states, you know, because of budgetary difficulties, etc., etc. Nation states in Europe were developed around the concept of welfare societies. And when the welfare is not as generous as it was before, this has an implication on the concept of nation state in itself. The second element is that, I mentioned that, but I think this is really at the core of the issue, is that the traditional parties which, you know, ruled nation states, the coalition of social democrats or coalition of conservatives, the influence of those two political blocs have been, you know, eroded, and now you have a different set of coalitions in Europe, and you have this rise of, you know, populist parties, either from the left or from the right, which are endangering, you know, the positions of these two blocks of traditional political parties. And I think also that there is another element in the crisis of nation states. It is the fact that, you're right, the nation state is in a way squeezed between the EU level European institutions, which are seen as remote, as inefficient, as unaddressing the needs of the population, and also the local territories. And in most of our countries, we see the rise of territories, we see the rise of regions, we see the rise of, you know, I would say, territorial solidarities at the regional level. And so there is a kind of squeezing effect, you know, for the nation state itself. On the migration, and just one thing, the problem is in front of us. Of course, we had, you know, all these waves of refugees, and you have all the images still in mind of the Balkan route, you know, with the flows of refugees coming from Syria. And we know that now, and we have also this flow of migrants coming through Libya to Italy, etc. But we have to take into account that even if we have accepted about 2 million migrants or refugees since 2 years, the issue of migration is behind us. And we will be confronted in the years to come to a massive issue of migrations because of the social economic conditions in underdeveloped countries, especially in Western Africa, because of the lack, the political vacuum in countries like Libya. This is why it is so important to find a political solution in Libya, because of the perpetuation of crisis in the Middle East, and with a likelihood of more refugees trying to leave this region and to go to find a safe harbor in Europe, and because also of the climate change impact, and it's you know, the migration due to climate change. And so I think this is probably one of the main challenges that Europe will have to face in the years to come. And I will just finish on defense. You're absolutely right, even if the conditions are completely different compared to 1954. But today there is a feeling that because of the withdrawal of the US from the European security, because of the threats we are facing, you know, with tensions at the borders of Eastern Europe, because of the threat of terrorism, I think we all know in Europe that we will have to reinvest in defense. We have disarmed Europe. We have made too many budgetary cuts in our defense apparatus. And we all know that we will have, you know, undoubtedly to reinvest in our defense sector, recreating, you know, more military jobs, reinvesting in equipment. And so the issue is, what can we do? Do we do that alone, or do we pool with other countries? And this is, I think, one element which probably will lower my anxiety regarding the effect of Brexit, because in terms of defense, Britain and France will be together because we have, you know, the same capacities. We are together at the Security Council of the United Nations. We have the same, you know, involvement in Africa. So I'm sure this is a field in which Britain and France will continue to act and to work together.
Hi. I just wanted to say a word about Euroscepticism, because actually you gave an extremely articulate version of the Eurosceptic argument, that it's, you know, Europe is what's helped to undermine the nation state and so on. I think it's important. I mean, I should be completely upfront. You know, I represent in the British Foreign Office the institution that's probably the most, through British history, the most pro-European, and Brexit creates an awful lot of work for us to do. But I think we have to acknowledge that there are legitimate arguments and legitimate concerns in the Eurosceptic case. And you're right, it's probably not so much directly and primarily driven as an underlying driver by migration or economic problems. It's about identity, and it's about political institutions and people's feeling that they are in contact with and able to control their political institutions. And that's why migration is a symbol of, when the British government says we received 3 million EU migrants and we can't do anything about it. It's literally nothing to do with us as the British government, whether those 3 million people cross the border and live. That's a legitimate thing for people to talk about. And so I think it's very important to distinguish between Euroscepticism on the one hand, which is a rational argument raising legitimate policy concerns and political concerns, and the separate strand of much more atavistic and sometimes racist and undemocratic political sentiment, which sometimes gets mixed up with Euroscepticism. Maybe you could call it Europhobia instead, but it's not the same thing. And if we merge them together, we create a bigger problem. Because first of all, we give the racist fringe too much credit by saying that they speak on behalf of the much bigger group of people who have legitimate concerns. And we don't give the legitimate concerns enough credit, because we tarnish them with this label of being nativist and racist, and therefore not to be excluded from the political realm. So though it's not for me to comment on French politics, but I can understand why many French people are enthusiastic about President Macron having rallied a very pro-European center of gravity in French politics. The question is, what happens to the legitimate concerns of Euroscepticism in France if it hasn't got a legitimate place in politics? And one of the blessings of Brexit is that racist politics is extremely marginalized in British political institutions. It is not represented in mainstream British political parties. And one of the reasons for that is the legitimate Euroscepticism has a place to live inside mainstream British parties. And so therefore they don't get pushed. People with those Eurosceptic concerns don't get pushed into the racist fringe. And so the small, tiny little groups who advocate a more right-wing racist politics in Britain, despite the efforts of some people tweeting from the United States, do not have any visibility and do not have any credibility.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these very eloquent explanations and comments. I have several questions here, and as you may expect, all are about external relations of Europe, European Union, and of Britain, by the way, especially in its relations with this part of the world. And one very general question not related to this part of the world is about the future of NATO, and you had said that it had become obsolete. So this is one question. A second question about Palestine, and why hasn't the UK government yet recognized the state of Palestine? And what is the French attitude towards the state of Palestine? Then, of course, questions about the decision to recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel and transferring the Israeli embassy to Jerusalem. How is Europe considering this decision? And how would this affect the future of relations between Europe and the Arab and Islamic world? Let's stop here, and then we'll take other questions. Ambassador Kaysen, this for you, probably this time.
Right, thank you. The future of NATO, what was the question exactly?
What do you think about the future of NATO? Where is NATO going?
Well, I think the British position and the French position on defence, and they think that the imperative that we take responsibility for defending ourselves and having armed forces which are able to defend ourselves in a changing world, and we resource that and we develop the means of international cooperation for that. The British and French positions are very close on that, and we have very close bilateral cooperation, and we have very close cooperation in NATO too, and Britain remains absolutely committed to the fundamental underlying vision of NATO, which is that we stand together, and we are treaty-bound to defend each other, and we're politically committed to that treaty obligation, and we're resourcing ourselves to make sure that we can that can remain credible. So NATO remains a vital part of Britain's international position, international memberships, even as we leave the EU. We're leaving the European Union, but we're not leaving Europe, and we're not leaving our posture as a very international country. We remain on the Security Council, we remain members of the G7, remain members of the G20, we remain core members of NATO and many other institutions. And if anything, Brexit will make us even more open. And for countries like Egypt, in our near neighbourhood, just beyond the borders of the European Union, there's an opportunity, because the slightly false divide between countries in the European Union being our very close partners and those outside being somewhat more foreign is not going to exist anymore for us. And we will have an economic imperative to make sure that we are making our way in the world and making our economic way in the world by forging deeper partnerships and not just relying on the European relationship. And so I hope to see, and I'm working to see as ambassador, an imperative of more economic engagement and more economic opportunities for Britain and Egypt together because of Brexit. On Palestine and Jerusalem, first of all, in response to the American announcement last week that they will be moving their embassy to Jerusalem, and that the American government recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the British Prime Minister and the British government has been very clear that we disagree with that decision. We do not think it helps the prospects for peace in the region. We do not have any plans to move our embassy, which is in Tel Aviv and will remain in Tel Aviv, because we consider that East Jerusalem is part of occupied Palestinian territory, and it needs to be dealt with in the context of negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians towards a final and lasting resolution of the conflict. So a solution, a two-state solution, which provides and recognizes for and recognizes the legitimate rights of the Palestinians is a very core pillar and principle of British policy in this region, and it has been for a long time. We feel a sense of national interest in seeing that. It's good for us as it's good for the region, and we feel a sense of moral imperative and moral obligation to defend that. The question of whether we make an announcement saying we recognize the Palestinian state today in advance of that settlement, in advance of the reality of it, we see as a secondary issue, because it doesn't in and of itself deliver rights for Palestinians. It doesn't in and of itself advance the peace process. And so if there comes a time when we think it could make a material difference to advance the peace process, it's something we're open to consider. But at the moment, we're focused on the underlying principle of how do we something that delivers the concrete reality of a Palestinian state, more importantly than which countries on our list have recognized it today or tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
On Palestine and Jerusalem, we are almost on the same line, France and Britain. This decision made by Trump is completely regretful. We absolutely disagree with it. The content of the decision is has to be it's questionable decision by its content, and the timing is completely inappropriate. Of course, we will not move our embassy, never, until a final solution, an agreed solution has been found for Jerusalem. So we have no plan at all. I just want to recall something, is that France was the country which, for the first time, when President Mitterrand addressed the Knesset in 1982, which promoted the idea, he was the first French leader to advocate for the creation of a Palestinian state. And this is our constant position. We will not derail from this position. There will not be any solution in this region without, the creation of a Palestinian state. So all the other ideas, even those floating around, and some of them, even we read, Palestinian state in the Sinai, etc. This is completely, crazy ideas. The only solution is a Palestinian state on the Palestinian ground, and of course through negotiations. The idea, the problem now is who could have enough influence to bring the Palestinians and the Israelis together, to find again the road to discussion and to peace settlement. Are the US still in a position to do that after Trump announcement? As the European Union the influence to do so? I doubt, and I don't think it will be recognized, for example, by the Israelis. So the consequence of Trump's decision is the fact that we will lack, for the time being, I would say, an honest broker in the peace negotiation. But I would say I wouldn't qualify it as a positive impact, but the impact of such a decision is to put again the Jerusalem issue, the Palestinian conflict, on the, I would say, on the front of the scene. It has been, probably a bit forgotten in the past months and years. And now, thanks to this announcement, I think there is a new, I would say, actuality of the Palestinian question. And if the consequence is a relaunching of discussion, then the Trump announcement would have an impact.
Thank you very much. I have more questions here. One question related to what we have just been saying is whether you see in the near future a more active role for Europe in suggesting ways to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then I have also a question to Ambassador Kaysen, whether you can envisage that if Labour returns to power, Labour could rejoin the European Union. Is this a possibility at all? Then a question also to Ambassador Kaysen, but I think that Ambassador Mathieu also would be interested in answering about the nature of the relationship between the UK out of the European Union and the European Union. And the question here mentions the model of Switzerland and the UK. You also have the recent agreement on Brexit. So what type of relations in Europe between the Britain across the Channel and the European Union? I have a question for Ambassador Gomati here. Whether you think that the results of the last presidential elections in France will be a model for other European countries in combating, in rejecting fascist parties. I have a question from Professor Mustafa Kamel El-Sayed. It's about whether public opinion in the UK has changed minds after the vote on Brexit. And to Ambassador Mate, the question is, whether the reserved or rejectionist attitudes of some French political currents towards the EU, whether these attitudes are genuinely related to the nature of the European project or to other causes. Yes, I think.
I can see there's some very artful people in this room, because all those questions sound very simple, but inside each one there's little IED lurking for diplomats to put their foot on. So let me have a go. I can't read my writing. The question of whether, under a different government, Britain might rejoin or change its mind about Brexit is one such IED question for any British diplomat. And so all I will simply say is that since the Brexit referendum, we had a general election in which the whole country voted, and two parties won the overwhelming majority of the votes, Labour and the Conservatives, who now form the government and the official opposition, and both parties were committed to delivering the will of the British people and delivering Brexit in the best possible way. In terms of what that Brexit is going to look like, will it look like Switzerland? It won't look exactly like any existing model, because it's going to have to be a very unique arrangement for a unique set of circumstances. The Swiss remain inside the single market, I think it's true to say, and therefore bound by a lot of regulations made in Brussels at which they're not at the table, and that idea is not acceptable to, again, either the British government or the British opposition. So we'll have an arrangement which seeks to be as close as possible to the European market and the European economy, but without being in the single market to the extent that we have to abide by all the decisions made in Brussels about consumer safety standards, environmental standards, and subject to the rulings of the European Court of Justice. So exactly what that model will look like and what we will call it, and whether we'll say it's Canada plus or Switzerland minus or Norway times 3, will be decided over the next year and a half of negotiation. What's happening to UK public opinion on Brexit is less than you might think, I think, is the answer. Despite all the obsession about Brexit in British politics for the last 18 months, the polls have not significantly moved. You get some polls where there's a majority against Brexit, but to be honest, most of the polls before the referendum also showed the public mostly against Brexit. There hasn't been a decisive shift of the nature that would really change the political weather at this stage. And finally, on should there be a more active role for Europe in Palestine? I mean, I would say yes, there needs to be an extremely active role for Europe, and I would say yes, we have been distracted by many other crises in this region. But I would agree with Stefan, Europe on its own is not going to suddenly become the broker, replacing the role that Clinton and others played. And nor is anybody else. This is going to have to be a collective effort. To my mind, if you take a step back, the nature of the problem in this region is that the days where one big power or two big powers could turn up and decide the shape of everything are gone. That tide has ebbed. The new tide has not flown in, and we have lots of actors who are very good at spoiling things and stopping things, and we don't have actors who on their own can forge solutions, which is challenging, but it's also good news for Stefan and me because it means that diplomacy is an absolutely necessary and essential business. We have to find ways to work together in groups of countries to forge consensus and get things done, and we can't any longer sit around waiting for one big power to come along and do it all for us. So we have a responsibility.
On this question, I completely agree with John. I don't see an immediate role for the EU, in the peace process. To make peace, you need three different things. First, you need principles. We have the principles. They have been established for decades and decades. We know what should be a peace agreement. So the principles, we know them. The second thing is that you need leaders of, the utmost quality and charisma. We need Mandelas, we need the Churchills, we need Adenauers. You make peace when you have great leaders. So do we have in Palestine and in Israel the leaders ready, to jump and to make the bet of peace? And the third, to have this kind of peace agreement, you need sponsors who brings guarantees, who brings development, etc., etc. I think at a certain stage, EU can be a sponsor, but if you don't have an agreement on the principles, and if you don't have the leaders, the sponsors will not play an efficient role. Back to your question on Macron. Macron being a model for other countries. Well, if I report such a wish from Egypt, he will certainly appreciate. One element, the election of Macron on a very pro-European agenda shows that a leader with such a highly European engagement could be elected in Europe. So there is no, I would say, fate of European disillusion. This is, I think, a good news, first point. Second point, it shows also that populist movements in Europe can be defeated. And the fact that Marine Le Pen was heavily defeated was, I think, a very good news for lovers of democracy and haters of populism. This is, I think, the meaning of Macron's election, and I hope other Macron will also be elected in other EU countries. And I think you have another question on. But I forgot it. I'm sorry, Dr. Ibrahim.
The rejectionist parties.
The rejectionist parties. They are using, yes, of course, they are using the EU as a scapegoat. But their core message, they are anti-migration parties. They are, of course, Europhobic parties, and they surf on the rejection of Europe. They surf, as I said in my presentation, also on the fear of, the impact of migration on our societies. This is the very, core reasons of why they are so high in the polls and in the elections. But what happened in France, with a drop in the electoral success of the National Front, shows that they can be defeated. And that you can also, when you speak of Europe, you can defeat the Europhobic people movement. So I think this is something very positive.
Thank you very much. In fact, I have a related question. Ambassador Kaysen asked whether and what will happen of the Eurosceptics in France. You said that in Britain, after all, after the Brexit, there is a space for all. And the question here I have is that Britain chose Brexit because of some issues the British people were faced with. France chooses deeper integration in order to address similar issues, after all. So the question, in fact, is about whether there really is a crisis of democracy in Western Europe, a crisis of governance, I would add. In fact, this rise in power of the identitative parties of the far right is probably also a manifestation of the crisis. So the question is, what do you think really about whether there really is, and what could be its results, its consequences of such a crisis? I have another two questions, but unrelated. So I think we can take up this question. What would you say, Ambassador Kaysen?
I mean, our political systems clearly, as I was saying, need to renew themselves, and they face challenges. And if they don't, there will be a crisis of democratic legitimacy. That is a big, profound problem for the European Union. That not just in Britain, but across the continent, only 1 in 3 people think the European Union is good for their country. In a sense, what we saw in Britain was the elite getting out of contact with that democratic view, and we saw a democratic correction. And one of the interesting things about having British and French people together is that in many ways our countries are so similar that the differences are fascinating. And one of the things that tells you an awful lot about the last 70 years in Europe is that I think the British and the French both have a profound sense of national identity, which they have no intention of giving away and losing. The French have a confidence, partly because they were in at the founding of the European Union and set its DNA, that more Europe means more French influence and more Frenchness. Whereas we have the opposite experience. We think more Europe means less Britishness and less British influence, and that Brexit is the sort of outworking of that strange psychological and emotional difference between our two countries. It may just be that French diplomats have been better in Brussels than British diplomats, so I think going back to whether there's a crisis of democracy in British politics, we definitely have a bumpy time at the moment, because we've gone from the age of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, where everybody believed that you win elections in the centre ground, and there's big convergence on the centre ground, to a world in which the political energy, for many reasons, disenchantment with the era that's just gone, the nature of activism online, and many other things, the political energy is at the right and left extremes of the mainstream. So at the moment it's probably right to say a kind of big centre of gravity in British public opinion, which isn't directly represented in a party. Macron's arrival in France sort of solves that problem in France at the moment as the cycle turns. I believe that political gravity eventually asserts itself, and eventually public opinion will find a way through to express itself in our political institutions. So they're challenged and they need to renew themselves, but I don't believe they're in crisis. I think they are the most precious assets we have are in political institutions in Britain. They're the basis of my confidence. Brexit is Britain's political institutions doing what they do best, which is having a big argument about a big issue we face, forging a consensus, if necessary, changing the shape of our politics, and then coming to a national conclusion. It's not pretty while it's happening. It's going on at the moment. It involves a lot of arguments. But I think our political institutions, I believe our political institutions are resilient enough. And as I said, what you've seen in British politics through the referendum and through the general election afterwards is a complete rejection, by the way, of racist, fascist populism. There's absolutely no place for it in any British party that has been elected a single seat in our parliament.
Well, on the crisis of our democracies, John put it very correctly. We have one syndrome in our Western democracies. This is the drop in the turnout in the elections. And this is something you can see everywhere, in every and in each Western country. This has a significance, when people are no longer interested in going to elections and to voting for their, to choose their leaders. This distancing has a significance. And it shows, in fact, a kind of feeling that whoever you select, he will be important, or she will be important, unable to address your demands in terms of protection, in terms of treating mass unemployment, especially among the young generations. And so this environment creates a distancing from the people to their leaders. And the fact that at each election, with a low turnout, the outgoing president, prime minister, or majority is systematically, beaten and replaced, and so you have a lack of, continuity in our democracies with the changes, which is the game. But when a majority is unable to get re-elected after 3, 4, or 5 years, this shows also a sign of, trouble, political trouble, and these are the signs of the crisis of our democracies.
But I just wanted to mention one point, because in Stefan's presentation, he mentioned that the younger people are more Eurosceptic. Actually, in Britain, it's the opposite. In the Brexit referendum, the young voted strongly for Europe, and it was the old who kicked us out of the European Union. And as a result, you have seen something which I think should give you a lot of hope for that the problem you're describing can be corrected. There's been a kind of resurgence of young people's engagement with British politics, and that's part of the reason why the Labour Party looks like it does at the moment. And we saw pretty high turnout, actually. But in a way, Brexit has reinvigorated the democratic debate in Britain, because politicians are doing something that really matters, and people are getting involved and having their say. And so I don't think it's inevitable, I think I would say. But we clearly need to be alert to it.
I think this is related to what you probably said. You have the highest employment ratio in Britain, whereas in France and in countries of Southern Europe, you have very high rates of unemployment of youth in particular. So this could probably explain. And I think also that the model of governance in Europe, and not only in Europe, is seriously in question, because even communication channels are different. You used to go vote every 4 or 5 years and go sleep for 4 or 5 years. Now you participate every day and several times. So I think there is a question here. Participation also needs to be redefined. I think this is, and it's good that we reconsider how people should be governed.
I think there is in Western countries a demand of doing politics in a different way.
Yes.
More participation to local decisions, more, I would say, social democracy, more debate on decisions of the daily life, more decentralization, etc., etc. So, yes, probably one of the elements of the crisis of our democracies is that the population is no longer recognizing itself in the way, the old traditional politics is working. And the fact that the government haven't been able to solve issues like massive unemployment is certainly one of the main reasons why there is such a distancing between the population and their governance.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think we have exhausted almost our time. So the last question, in fact, that I have here is a very ambitious question. And it's not about the future of Europe, it's about the future of the world. So I would invite you to say a few words of the world. So I would invite you to say a few words in closing about how you can conclude about the future of Europe in the world. And a few minutes, I'll give you the floor first, and then to Ambassador Mate, and then we'll call it a day or an evening.
Right, the future, the future of the world. I'm not sure I'm any more competent to talk about that than anybody else in this room. I think I would go back to what I was saying, that the 20th century, after quite a lot of bloodshed, ended up being the century in which a particular model triumphed, which was, it was democratic, but also governments were the main political actors. And governments achieved some of the greatest miracles in human history, leaving aside the pyramids. Apart from the pyramids, some of the greatest miracles in human history were achieved by governments in the 20th century, putting a man on the moon, abolishing polio, many other things. But also governments committed some of the worst crimes in human history. And the 21st century is different. First of all, the model is being challenged. We see people pointing to China, people pointing to Russia, and saying that authoritarian capitalism is now the future. And democracy is anemic, democracy makes you weak, democracy is finished. And we see people, I think, trying to assert the role of strong states at the expense of the balance between state and society. And so I think that the story of the 21st century, and particularly probably the story of what happens to China, will be the outworking of, are those people right, or are those of us who inherited the 20th century worldview right? And I think it's definitely in 2017 too early to be 100% certain. It is definitely too early to say that the Chinese model of authoritarian capitalism is a bankable winner. China is about to live through the phase where it's created a big middle class. And there's never yet been a big middle class created by rapid economic development which hasn't started to demand its rights and to demand that things like corruption are tackled and hasn't required the opening up of intellectual space and political space. China may be about to prove it's different from every other society on Earth. Even if it does, it doesn't necessarily mean that every other society on Earth can follow it with different cultures and different values. But my personal view is that two things will prove to be true by the time we get to the end of the century. One is this will not have been the age of the state on its own. It will be the age of partnership. And if we succeed in making the world a better place, it will be because we empower partnerships between governments who won't any longer have the role of telling everyone what to do and providing for everybody, but they will have the role of convening the private sector, the entrepreneurs, the civil society, the academics, all the other actors, and taking advantage of the miracles of technology and science that we're seeing around us. So going from a world where states dominate to where states empower, I think, is one thing. And the other is that a necessary condition of that is that states will have to be subject to the rule of law, by which I mean not the state ruling people with the law, I mean the law ruling over and constraining the activity of the state. States will have to be subject to transparency, they will have to be inclusive, they will have to allow for debate, because you can't have good policy if people aren't talking about it and exposing the errors. You can't have good public services if people can't measure and have data to know whether public services are good or not. And hold people accountable if they're not good. You can't have social cohesion if people's frustrations do not have a safety valve in genuine political debate. When I talk about this in Egypt, I tend to avoid using the D word, democracy, because it has lots of connotations that can confuse the discussion and carries connotations of Western neo-imperialism and so on. So leave aside the word democracy. You can call what I've described whatever you like, but I don't think you can be a successful, sustainable, flourishing society and economy in the 21st century without those kind of healthy political institutions. So I hope the future, the history of the world, is that we all together prove the truth of what I'm saying.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omar. It's of Europe and the world. Europe and the world.
Oh, thank you. Easy question. We all face the same challenges. They are global. They are not local. They are, affecting each and every of our countries: Europe, Middle East, Asia, Africa, America, all the continents. And we know which are those global challenges. We mentioned migrations, which is, I think, a huge challenge we'll have to face in the coming years and decades. Environmental issues, the strategic impact of climate change on the move of populations, on refugees, on our economic model. I think this is certainly the long-term challenge number one. The issue for the world is how do we address these global challenges, which are, affecting all the countries? What kind of regulation do we put in place? And so we have two sets of options: whether we choose, regulation, or I would say selfishness. Whether we choose multilateralism, or we choose, I would say, a nationalistic approach. I think that the state of the world, those challenges, of course, they require a global, multilateral, regulatory approach, which means strong institutions at the UN level and also at, I would say, regional level. And this is why my feeling is that because of the magnitude of these challenges, European projects, which was probably the brightest idea which came after the Second World War, and despite all the difficulties which we are facing, has to be relaunched, because Europe could only unite its forces to tackle with these huge challenges. So the answer to these global challenges is more cooperation, more partnership, and certainly more Europe.
Thank you very much. Just at the end, in fact, I think you talked about multilateralism, and the UK is also an example of internationalism. It is open to the seas, and so. But you added regionalism, and yes, regionalism and multilateralism could be reinforcing, but even Britain, in fact, historically also called for European regionalism. Churchill called for European unity in his famous Zurich speech. But without Britain. So I think the interest is really in this piece of fantastic political engineering that European integration has been. And I think this is what drives and calls the attention of people interested in politics everywhere. And it is an experience which has been emulated to different degrees of success in the developing world, in Latin America, in Africa, and in the Arab world, and unfortunately not very successfully, but it has. So I think that there is an example that we can benefit from, and we can benefit also from the choice of acting with more liberty, unrestrained by rules. Britain also is a country, is a free trade country. So, and I think that all of this, I think what you have contributed today has enriched our knowledge And we thank you very much for that. And we look forward to other opportunities where we will welcome you also here. Thank you very much. Thank you all.